So, just as a quick review, what year was the first return? What's happening here? Microphone's on. Okay. All right. Is that better? Oh, that is. Okay. See, I told you it was on the right side. I was so focused on that, I forgot to turn it on. All right. So, what year was the first return back from the land after captivity? What year was that? Yes, 538. Very good. Under which person? Zerubbabel. Okay, and then what about the second return? And the second return was under Ezra, and that was what year? Anybody remember that one? Okay, yeah, 458. Great. And then the final return, the third return, which it seems like it was kind of just Nehemiah by himself. I mean, he had like a military escort, but what year was that when Nehemiah came back? Yeah, 445, and they all had these different purposes. So the first return was to rebuild the temple. The second return was to rebuild the people by teaching them the law. And then Nehemiah comes, and he's going to help rebuild the walls that have been in ruins to try to salvage God's glory and salvage God's city there. And of course, in between, we had the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. And Haggai said, hey, get back to work. And Zechariah said, God is zealous for Zion, so get back to work. And they got back to work. And then we read about Esther and the extermination avoided for the Jews. And then we'll have Malachi later, which Adam and I, if you guys have suggestions, by the way, we've never done that before. If you have suggestions about helpful mnemonic devices for Malachi, let us know, because that's the last one. We're excited. We've been able to make mnemonic devices for all these prophets, and we've got Malachi as the last one. So if you have anything, let us know, and don't feel bad if we turn your idea down, but just, submit one anyway. Hey, Adam and I turn each other's ideas down all the time. I'll give Adam one, he's like, that's terrible. He'll give me one, that's terrible. And then we settle somewhere else. So anyway, Malachi's coming up, and basically the book is going to be about honoring your covenant with God. So what did we say was a good memory mnemonic device for Nehemiah? All right, new wall. See, and that was an opportunity, a chance where Adam and I had an idea, and it wasn't very good, because we said need to rebuild the wall, and then someone came up with something way better, and we got your input, new wall. That's a great way to remember Nehemiah. And let me say this. Nehemiah, he's cupbearer to the king in Persia. He finds out the walls are in ruins, and he knows, I've got to do something about it. And he decides he's going to leave Susa, the capital of Persia. He's going to travel all the way over to Jerusalem, about a 5-month trip, to help rally and motivate the people to get back to where rebuild this wall. What kind of attitude do the people have when Nehemiah comes and tells them to rebuild the wall? Let's do it. Yes, absolutely. Let's arise and let's build this wall. They had a mind to work. And Nehemiah is a great leader. He sacrifices already his high position in the palace of Susa, kind of like Moses did, right? Leaving the palace of Egypt to come suffer reproach with his brethren. Nehemiah does that same thing, and he fights alongside his brethren for God's honor. And it is a fight because these enemies keep taunting them, and not just taunting them, but making death threats against them, really terrorist threats, saying, look, you don't know when we're coming, but we're coming and we're going to kill you. Can you imagine trying to get work done and you have no idea when your enemy's going to come? Maybe in the middle of the night, they're going to kill you. This is what they're up against, and Nehemiah now in chapter 6 is going to change a little bit in the sense that the enemies are going to change their tactic. So in chapter 6, they're almost finished with the wall, still have some gates to rebuild. Now the enemies are going to turn their attention to Nehemiah. We can bring down their leader. We can take all of them out. We can discourage all of them. This is going to be their new strategy. And so our main message, our main focus in this lesson this morning is that great leaders stay focused on their great work for God. Nehemiah shows us what laser focus on a goal for God looks like, and he will not allow any distractions to keep him from accomplishing this great work for God. It's very inspiring what we're going to see from Nehemiah today. So let's get into chapter 6 after all that review, Nehemiah 6, and let's look in verses 1 and 2. Nehemiah 6, 1 and 2. Now, when it was reported to Sanballat and Tobiah and to Geshem the Arab and to the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and that no breach remained in it, although at that time I had not set up the doors in the gates, then Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to me saying, "Come, let us meet together at Sepharim in the plain of Ono," but they were planning to harm me. So keep in mind that Nehemiah was a governor, and these enemies of his, these leading men, were also governors. So it would have been very natural under normal circumstances for these guys to get together and to have a meeting. That was not really an abnormal request normally, that these political leaders would get together and maybe, hey, let's work out a deal. Let's see if we can kind of work something out. But Nehemiah already knows what kind of people these are. He knows how horrible these guys are. He's thinking there's no way that I'm going to go out there and meet you, because they're trying to separate Nehemiah from the group. They're trying to get the leader all alone so they can kill him. And I love his response, verse 3. I sent messengers to them saying, "I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" So he says, this work is just too great. It's too important for me to stop and be distracted by a meeting with you all. And you can just imagine how furious they must have been. These are government officials who have been appointed by Persia to their position. You can just imagine, you're refusing a meeting with us? How dare you? Who do you think you are? And don't you know who we are? But Nehemiah says he has better things to do. And so they're relentless, and they don't give up. And they send 4 more letters requesting the same, hey, come out and meet with us, come out and meet with us. He responds the same way all 4 times. And so here's a great question for us. What is your great work? In order to be a great leader and stay focused on your great work, you have to identify the great work that God has called you to focus on. And I understand there's going to be multiple great works that we have to do as Christians throughout our life, and sometimes those works shift over time. But great leaders know how to prioritize. They know how to focus on the 1 or 2 main great works that they have so that they won't get distracted. So for instance, if you're a shepherd of a congregation, your great work is to shepherd the sheep of the flock, to watch over the souls of people in your congregation. The elders will tell you there's a ton of other things that elders have to do and that can come up, but their greatest work is the souls of the flock here. If you're a parent, tons of things to do. You got careers, you have all kinds of pressures on your time. Your great work is to raise your children in the discipline and the admonition, the nurture and admonition of the Lord. As Christians in the local church, lots of things. But our great work is to worship God, study His Word, love one another, and reach the lost. Let me say a couple things about distractions, and then I'll get your input here. Some distractions are absolutely deadly, like they were for Nehemiah here. That if you go down that path, Satan is trying to get you all alone so he can take you out. But other distractions, they may not be deadly. They just pull you away from a great work to do another work that's not as important. It might be a good work, but it's not the great work that we should be focusing on. And sometimes we just need to be able to say no, even to something that is maybe a good or a decent work, to say no because I have a great work and I cannot come down from it. We can't do everything. And great leaders know what their strengths and weaknesses are, where they fit in God's kingdom, what their focus needs to be, and they stay focused on that. So let me ask then, what are some distractions to our great work as Christians? What are some distractions? And you can be as specific or general as you want to be.
Relationships.
Okay, relationships. How so? You want to elaborate? How so in relationships? How can they be distracting?
Even we know. you have faith and you walk in the light of God, and your partner does not, and you cause turmoil in your household and in your life.
Great, yeah, so you could have relationships, even sometimes the closest relationship in your marriage, and if that person is not living right for the Lord, you're so focused on trying to fix things with this person, and maybe even trying to fix this person, that you're kind of distracted from the Lord. Yeah, really good thought. What else? What are the distractions? Yes, sir, Bill.
Entertainment.
Yeah, entertainment. Man, it's just huge. It's endless. It's Netflix. It's binge watching. You don't have to watch a show. It used to be you'd watch a show and then it was over and you'd be like, oh man, I have to wait till next week to watch it again. No, not anymore. Just, keep playing, keep hitting continue. In fact, have you ever had Netflix? This is embarrassing. But I know it's happened to you too, so I'm going to say it. Have you ever been watching Netflix and it cuts off and it says, are you still watching? Yes. Continue or not? Like, it's in disbelief that you could possibly still be sitting in front of the television, but you are. So it's embarrassing. And then you click, of course I'm still watching. What are you talking about? It's just getting good. But of course we joke about it, but man, if we spent that much time reading our Bibles, calling people in the congregation to encourage people, putting spiritual work first, our great work first, wow. B, and then Carol.
Political concerns.
Yes, politics. Of course, so much turmoil. You turn on the news, everything's just so politically charged that people just get into those discussions and they act like that's a sign of your, Christianity or your holiness, your association with a certain party or with a certain candidate. And we just, Facebook especially, just bicker. Even Christians jumping in and insulting and just being so insulting and nasty and driving people away from Christ with that distraction. Carol?
Some cases our work can interrupt what's going on.
Absolutely. Focus on career and our money, and we just want to climb that ladder and have that prestige. And there's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with being high up in a company, but if it pulls you away from your great work, it's trouble. It's trouble. It's Satan trying to isolate you, get you alone so he can harm you. Chloe? Okay, yeah, you're sorry, Chloe. You still got to do your homework. That's just a nice try. But yeah, absolutely, though. You're right. I mean, people, especially because there's so much pressure today on students, right, to get the best grades. And if you want to get into the best schools, you want to get the best jobs. So much emphasis on studying, that you can put your homework before your work on your soul, and that's trouble. Yeah, really good thoughts. Yeah, one more.
Yourself. You can put a lot of emphasis just on yourself, and some people do that, and it's kind of self-deception as far as like, well, if I'm eating right, if I'm exercising right, and if I'm doing everything right, then I'm okay, but you're not really moving out to where you're loving your brothers and sisters beyond yourself. Just internally focused.
Yeah, really good. And that's especially probably true because there is such kind of a health craze movement in our society today, and that's great to be healthy physically, but sometimes even Christians can focus so much on their physical appearance, and they're in the gym for 4 hours a day, but they won't pick up their Bibles, and that's like you said, focus on the wrong thing. So all great examples, a lot of other things that we could talk about, but I just want you to see how Satan can really, distract us. I think about, the church getting distracted by petty squabbles, right? Or debates over obscure Bible passages or something like that. And just, Satan eats that stuff up. He wants us to be distracted from our great work for God. All right, well, here's a new tactic. Now the enemies threaten to report Nehemiah. What do they threaten to report about him? They actually threaten to report him to the king of Persia. What do they threaten? Yeah, Terry?
That he's made himself king and they're planning a rebellion.
Okay, yeah, that Nehemiah's plan is once they get the walls finished, he's going to be their king and they're going to rebel against Persia. Also, it's interesting because all these 4 other letters that they sent seem like private correspondence between them and Nehemiah, but here it says they sent an open letter. Now, there's some debate about exactly what an open letter was in that culture, but it seems to imply that this wasn't just private correspondence, but somehow the public would actually get access to this letter. So all the Jews would have heard about this charge as well. And I want you to see why this would have been such an effective scare tactic to use on the Jews. Let's go back to Ezra 4. I want to show you something very interesting. Ezra 4. Now, chronologically, Ezra 4 takes place in the first return under Zerubbabel in the days of King Cyrus of Persia. But there's a section starting in verse 7 that tells about an event that happened later in the future under King Artaxerxes, the king who sent Ezra and Nehemiah back. So he jumps to the future in verse 7. Notice Ezra 4, verse 7. In the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam, Mithridath, and Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic. Now, what I want you to see is that this event here is probably toward the beginning of King Artaxerxes' reign. Probably around 464 BC. I mean, I put a question mark there because we actually know when Artaxerxes began reigning, 464, but we don't know the exact year that this letter was sent, but probably sometime around the beginning of King Artaxerxes' reign. And apparently, the Jews had actually tried building the walls already, long before Nehemiah came. But they were stopped because their enemies wrote a letter to King Artaxerxes, and look at the charge they leveled against them in verse 12. They say, "Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now let it be known to the king that if that city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll. It will damage the revenue of the kings." Drop down to verse 15. "Let there be a search made in the record books of your fathers, and you will discover in the record books and learn that that city is a rebellious city and damaging to kings and provinces, and that they have incited revolt with it in the past days. Therefore that city was laid waste. We inform the king that if that city is rebuilt and the walls finished, as a result, you have no possession in the province beyond the river." So the charge is the same here, that if they finish the walls, become their own city, they're going to rebel against you, King Artaxerxes. So Artaxerxes shuts it down. Now, when I first read this, I thought, how is this happening? Because remember, Persian kings are not allowed to reverse decrees that they made. So what I was thinking is, how is it possible that King Artaxerxes makes a decree to stop working on these walls, but then later under Nehemiah, this same king reverses that decree and lets Nehemiah rebuild? The answer is in verse 21 of Ezra 4. Look at the wording. This is what the king said. "Now issue a decree to make these men stop work, that this city may not be rebuilt until a decree is issued by me." So what the king does is he makes a temporary decree here to stop the work. And he says they are to stop unless I come back and change my mind about it. So he actually builds in a clause that allows him to change it later. So, and let me say this, perhaps he does that temporarily to see if the charges of the enemies are true. Let's see if they really are a rebellious people. Let's see if there's really anything to this charge. So 7 years later, from that point, Ezra asks Artaxerxes, that same king, if he can go teach the law. And Artaxerxes gives him permission, but he does not give Ezra permission to rebuild the walls. It's not until 13 years later, after that point, in 445 BC, that Artaxerxes reverses that temporary decree he made in Ezra 4:21 and gives Nehemiah permission to rebuild the walls. Now, that means a couple interesting things. Number one, when Nehemiah found out that the walls were in ruins, it's not because the Jews didn't care about the walls. It's not because the Jews had not tried already to rebuild the walls. They did try, but they were forcefully stopped by the king. And so, do you see why the threat now in Nehemiah 6 would have been such an effective scare tactic for the Jews? They would say, it's like deja vu all over again. This same king, they're making the same charge against us that we're rebellious, and now probably we're going to just get shut down again. Now, why do you think King Artaxerxes was willing to reverse the decree and let Nehemiah go back to rebuild the walls? I realize we can't know for sure, but I think we're pretty fair guessing here.
I'm sure he was aware of the history of Mordecai saving the life of the previous king.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. He was aware of that history. Yeah, that's a good thought as well. And I also think it had been 20 years since his first decree in Ezra 4. And he had 20 years to see, these people haven't rebelled against me. They're living as citizens. They're not doing anything wrong. And so he lets Nehemiah go 20 years later to rebuild these laws. So here's the thing. I wonder if part of the reason, the reason I'm bringing all this up is the enemies, they don't actually report Nehemiah. It's just an empty threat. And I wonder if that might be because they're not convinced the king will believe it. I mean, there's already been a charge of rebellion leveled against them in the past, and this same king seemed to be just fine sending Nehemiah back. So now if they make a charge of rebellion again, especially against Nehemiah, because remember, the king is the one who sent Nehemiah. The king is the one who made Nehemiah governor. So if they charge Nehemiah with treason, and they're found out to be liars, that's trouble for them. So Nehemiah doesn't budge, and this is just an empty threat. They don't end up reporting him at all. And I think it's because of this kind of conflation of all their history when you put it all together. And notice what he says, back in Nehemiah 6 now, verses 8 and 9. Then I sent to him a message to him saying, such things as you are saying have not been done, but you are inventing them in your own mind. For all of them were trying to frighten us, thinking they will become discouraged with the work, and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. So here's another one of those awesome arrow prayers, by Nehemiah. He's such a great leader because he just always walks as if he is in God's presence. And if he needs something from the Lord, if he needs strength, he's going to pray right then and there for strength. If he needs wisdom, he's going to pray right then and there for wisdom from his God. If he's angry at his enemies, he'll pray right there for God to remember his enemies and bring them to justice for it. Essentially, in verse 9, he's praying for God to help him stay focused on the great work. He's saying, help me have the strength not to crumble under the pressure and the weight of these enemies. And Nehemiah shows us we can't. We simply cannot do the great work of God without God. And he's always got God with him. It's just really remarkable and inspiring. Any comments or thoughts? I know that chronology was possibly a little bit confusing, but any comments or questions about that in that section? Okay, well, let's keep going to the next section because enemies, they don't stop. Now they hire prophets to lead Nehemiah into sin. They're still trying to bring down the leader because so often is the case, you take out the leader, the followers go down. It's like Jesus said, you strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. And look at verse 10. When I entered the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined at home, he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. And let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. And they are coming to kill you at night. So Shemaiah, the prophet here, he makes it seem like he's really interested in getting Nehemiah to safety. I really care about you. Your enemies are coming to kill you. And so what we should do is let's meet together in the temple. Let's lock ourselves in the temple, and the enemies won't be able to get you. Now, what is the major problem with that? He's not a priest. He has absolutely no right to go into the temple. The last man who tried that was King Uzziah, and he was struck with leprosy. And so basically, by seeking safety in the temple against his human enemies, he'll become an enemy of God in the process. So he basically says in verse 11, should a man like me flee? And could one such as I go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. So he looks at this prophet and are you crazy? Going into the temple? Now, let me ask you this. What do you think he means by the first part when he says, should a man like me flee?
He's the governor.
All right, he's the governor. He's the leader of the people. If the leader of the people is fleeing, what's that going to do to the morale? And how hypocritical. Here's Nehemiah. He's trying to strengthen the people and say, stand strong against your enemies. You know, we got this. And then he goes and he hides in the temple. It would be totally hypocritical. And so he's not going to have any of that. And of course, you know, God is his God. If he goes and hides, he's showing I have no faith in the Lord. And just a side note here, I realize this isn't what the verse is talking about, but I want to point out how it can be really easy for us as Christians to hide from the world and kind of stay huddled up in fear in the church building instead of going out and serving and reaching the lost. I mean, we're not governors of a physical kingdom, but we are Christians reigning with Christ, our victorious King. So we should be asking the question, should people like us hide and flee from the threats of our enemies? No way. No way. We have Christ as our King and our leader. And secondly, he's saying, you know, I have no right to go into the temple. And immediately he knows this is a false prophet. Because if you're really from God, you're not going to counsel rebellion against the Lord. You're not going to say something that is against God's law. Deuteronomy 13 lays out that qualification for identifying a false prophet. And that's just so practical for us today because so many people claim to be religious and, hey, yeah, I follow Jesus, absolutely. But then they have totally different beliefs than Jesus held. And there's some disconnect there. Look at verse 13. Nehemiah says this about Shemaiah. He was hired for this reason, that I might become frightened and act accordingly in sin, so that they might have an evil report in order that they could reproach me. Isn't this one of Satan's favorite strategies? If he can tempt a leader in the church, like a preacher or a shepherd, to fall into sin, he can fill the whole church with disappointment and despair and disillusionment and really hinder God's great work. So great leaders always need great character. And so the enemies realize if we can just discredit Nehemiah's character, if we can just show him to sin against his God, they can try to take him down from his great work. And Nehemiah, he speaks to the great leader again in verse 14, God, and he says, remember these wicked prophets for this horrible thing that they're trying to do to me. Here's a question. What are some ways to keep ourselves from disillusionment and despair if we see a leader of God's people fall into sin? It's kind of a hard question to ask. I don't expect that to happen. Hopefully that never happens here at this congregation. But sometimes these things happen. How can we prepare now so that we don't scatter, if the shepherd is stricken down? Yeah, Jason?
This happened when I was a younger boy. There was a gospel preacher who I just thought the world of. And, I thought he was all... And my dad cautioned me at a very young age. He said, Jason, Bill is not divine, and it's not Bill Feist.
Okay, thank you. That's good.
It's not my dad, it was also Bill. It was a third Bill.
Okay.
But he said, Bill is not divine. He can fall. He was like, you cannot put your faith in confidence. So my suggestion in the preparation is to keep that perspective. That no matter what a wonderful elder somebody is or a wonderful preacher somebody is, that we need to understand that they are just a man. And remember, even David, who was called a man after God's own heart, committed some atrocious sins against God.
Absolutely.
And so we need to understand, one, that anybody can fall because... And that person, by the way, has already sinned, right? Because all have sinned.
Sure.
And we need to have that in perspective. But then we also need to, on the flip side, is they can be saved again, too, if they fall into sin. Mm-hmm. And we need to remember that same grace that got us into the relationship with God can get us back into it when we mess it up. So I think those two things.
Yeah, very well said. It reminds me of what Jesus said, and I'll get to you in a second, Jack. In Matthew 23:10, he says, do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. Now, in this context, Jesus is talking about leader in the sense of some title or rank in the kingdom, as if somebody is looking at you, holding you up on a pedestal in the hierarchy of the kingdom. You're our leader. And the problem is, what happens when that leader falls into sin? Well, now you're lost. because you're not following the right leader. The right leader is Jesus. And Jesus never will fail you. Jesus never sinned and never will. So he's the one we have to stay focused on. And that'll really strengthen us. Jeff?
Piggyback on what Rick said, I think of leaders that have fallen and still can rise up and serve like Peter. I mean, can we imagine denying that we know Jesus? I mean, that was just an awful stumble that he made. Satan tried to use that to just destroy the apostles, right? But he repented, confessed that sin, repented, and he ended up being a pillar in the church, right? So he is human. He will fall. That doesn't mean that he can never really serve the Lord righteously.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah, Peter's a great example. Even Jesus knew that was going to happen. He said, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, Peter. But then the very next thing he says is, but when you return, strengthen your brethren. You know, so yeah, great thought. Jack and then Bill.
Real quick point here. There's a sermon or a book by Bill Hall called Two Men, and he contrasts two men, and he does the man who loves the church and the man who loves Christ. And I was on the wrong side of that particular persuasion at one point in time, and I've been trying in my life to get that straight.
Great. Yeah. So love, be Christ-centered, not church-centered, because in the church, you're going to have imperfect people. You're going to get hurt, probably. And if your faith is in the church, that you're going to be disappointed. If your faith is in Jesus, never be disappointed. Yeah. Okay, Bill, and then we'll move on.
Satan is very crafty and powerful and very good at what he does, and he would target all of us, of course, but he would like to get as many as he could in one person who falls.
Yes.
So if he can get someone who has a lot of influence to fall, and in doing so, get many others to fall along with that one.
Yes.
That's easy work for him.
Yeah.
So we have to remind ourselves that even though we have someone who we really look up to spiritually, who is human, that person is also subject to the temptations that Satan is going to throw at all.
Yeah, and I love what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2, where he says, he's talking about Satan, he says, we are not ignorant of his schemes. So if you know ahead of time, one of Satan's favorite schemes is to pull down the leader so that all the followers will scatter, then you can determine, I'm not going to give Satan the satisfaction. He's not taking me down with that person. And I don't mean that pridefully, like Peter, I'll never fall. I just mean I'm determined. I've set my heart to fight against that particular scheme of Satan because, yeah, at some point in our life that may happen to us. So now in chapter 6, the wall is finished. Once they set their mind to the great work and they stay laser focused, it actually only took them 52 days. And when the enemy saw it, they lost confidence. They ended up being discouraged because they saw that their God was with them. They saw there was nothing they could do, despite their relentless attacks, to stop them from building this wall. And ironically, Sanballat earlier had gathered all these enemies to his side. And that actually worked out well. Because the more enemies Sanballat was to gather to his side, the bigger the audience to watch the glory of God and to humble themselves before him. So again, it's one of those awesome, ironic reversals in Scripture where God just laughs, in heaven at people who try to take down his plans and his goals. And of course, the enemies didn't give up completely. This talks about Tobiah making alliances with some of the noblemen among the Jews, apparently by marriage. And those Jews actually sent letters to Tobiah so he could keep tabs on Nehemiah. And whenever he found out some detail about Nehemiah, he would still send him threatening letters. So even though the wall is finished, they can't let their guard down. They can't just sit on their laurels because the enemies are still trying to destroy them, trying to discourage them, trying to distract them. But great leaders stay focused on God's great work. And that's why in chapter 7, Nehemiah takes a census. I'm just going to go through this very quickly, this chapter, because it's mainly a genealogy. But Nehemiah sets guards on all of the walls of the city, and he orders them to keep the gates closed most of the time, to keep the enemies from sneaking in. And this census is going to help him know who belongs in the city, who doesn't belong. And because the city was actually underpopulated right now, it kind of gives him an idea of what he's working with, his resources. And that's another sign of great leaders. Great leaders know what resources they have to work with at their disposal. And so this whole census will help them with that. Nehemiah chapter 8 now. The people gather to renew the covenant. Verses 1 and 2, Nehemiah chapter 8. It says, all the people gathered as one man at the square which was in front of the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Then Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. So in the law of Moses, it was required that all the males would come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for the 3 major feasts. But interestingly, and I don't know how I missed this when we were studying through the Old Testament, or maybe I knew it and I forgot about it. In the law of Moses, God actually commanded not just the males, but everybody to come to Jerusalem every 7 years to hear the reading of the law and to renew their covenant commitment with God. And so here what we see is Ezra, another great leader, staying focused on his great work of teaching the law to the people. And they all gather, not just the men, but the women and the children, just inside the water gate. And here's an image of that gate where the star is. They would have been just inside that square there, hearing the law read and renewing the covenant. I mean, just imagine for a moment how different their history would have been had they actually followed through with God's plan to come back every 7 years and renew their knowledge of the law. I mean, how many times do you read in the Israelite history of a generation arising, they didn't seem to know the Lord? Well, why? Because they didn't do this. He's so wise. He's so brilliant. He had this perfect plan in his law every 7 years, reunify, gather back around my covenant, learn my law, and instead you have prophets coming like Hosea saying, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Yet it never would have happened if they would have kept this command. And so they read the law, and I think this is why initially this is their reaction. Look in verse 9, at the very end of verse 9. It says, all the people were weeping when they heard the words of the law. I think this is why they're weeping, because when they read the law, they're hearing verses like Deuteronomy 31 that told them they should have been meeting every 7 years, and they know they weren't. And they're hearing God's warnings that if you disobey, I'm going to send you into captivity to a foreign land. And basically, their whole history is unfolding before them as they hear this law, and it's all coming clear that this is all our fault. None of this horrible stuff would have happened to us if we would have just kept the covenant and done what God said. And so they break down in tears. How else did they react? Because their reaction is so vastly different from the pre-captivity Jews in their hearts. How else are their reactions different than those pre-captivity Jews? I think I have that on the screen. Yeah, there we go. What about their reaction, Jack?
They set up false worship in the temple.
Okay, all right. So that was a negative about the pre-captivity Jews. What's so great about these Jews in particular in the present that we're studying now? What's so great about their reaction? Yes, a good thing. Mm-hmm.
They understand the sins that they've been committed.
Okay, yeah. So they clearly understand enough to where they start weeping. Yeah, they have a soft heart. Sure. What else about their reaction, Terry?
They were actually interested in the law. The pre-captivity Jews were not even interested.
Yeah, you realize how powerful the word. It's just one word in chapter 8. See if I can find it. All right, I'm not sure where it is. That's terrible. Anyway, oh boy, that was going to be awesome, and I just ruined the moment. All right, it's the word attentive. Oh, I know it's in there, right? I'll just find it later when I'm not under pressure. Attentive. They were attentive to the law. You never saw that in the pre-captivity Jews. They closed their ears. They wanted to kill the prophets. They weren't listening, and I probably need to rush through for time's sake here. They're attentive. They stand outside for 6 hours listening to the law being read. Let's remember that before we complain about sitting in the AC for 3 hours for our services, right? Standing for 6 hours. And their hearts are moved by God's word. They lift their hands to praise God, and then they fall on their face in humility before Him. Oh, verse 3. Thank you. Herb was attentive, and he saw the word attentive there at the very end of verse 3. Great. Attentive to the book of the law. Never saw that in pre-captivity. Really an amazing change in these people. But amazingly, Nehemiah tells them, hey, this isn't the time to mourn. He doesn't rebuke them for their tears. Their tears are a good thing. But he says, listen, this is a time of new beginnings. We're renewing our covenant. And he said, I love what he says in verse 10. He says, the joy of the Lord is your strength. You know, I preached last week about the power of godly tears. This is where godly tears take us. It leads us to be reminded that despite our horrible failings, God forgives us, and when we turn to Him and renew our commitment to Him, it just strengthens our hearts with joy, and we're renewed and motivated. That's why reading our Bibles can really be an emotional roller coaster. Because in one passage, you're learning about how horrible you are and how far short you've fallen against God. And then the next, you're learning about God's grace. He loves you, and He's on your side, and He wants you to succeed for Him. So it's just so powerful when we spend time in God's Word and are attentive to the Word like they are. Let's get this last section in so I can open it up for comments. But here in this last section, the people keep the Feast of Booths. The 7th month was a culmination of the harvest year. So they would, or the harvest for the year. And they would gather in their crops for the final time and give thanks for God's provision at sometimes it was called the Feast of Ingathering, but other times the Feast of Booths, starting on the 15th of the month for about a week. And they would also build these lean-to shelters, or booths, out of different leafy tree branches and palm fronds to remind them of their nomadic lifestyle when they were wandering through the wilderness after they were set free from Egypt on the way to Promised Land. Well, apparently the text says they hadn't actually built these booths since the days of Joshua. They had kept the Feast of Booths, you know, the feasting part and the grateful to God for the harvest part. They didn't actually build these booths all around the city and lived in them since the time of Joshua. Now, I'm not 100% sure why that is, though probably they just didn't want to. Who wants to live in that for a week? That doesn't look fun. But it would be such a powerful spiritual exercise for them because it would remind them of their salvation from Egypt. It would remind them of their sin, which caused them to wander in the wilderness. It would remind them of their utter, complete dependence on God. Yeah, you're in this great city. You have all these great things, but really, you're in a shack and you're completely dependent on the Lord, wandering through the wilderness. So Ezra and Nehemiah are two great leaders working together here. Nehemiah building the walls, Ezra building the people. And look at the marvelous things they've accomplished by staying focused on their great work for the Lord. Any comments or questions? That's all I had. Anna?
I worked for a Jewish dentist once, and they have some holiday or something around that, because he told us about building that in the backyard.
Yeah, so they still, many of them will still celebrate, the Feast of Booths. Sure. Adam?
That verse about the rebuilding in 52 days has always been amazing to me. Especially, Wednesday, I thought about when we looked at the enormity of these walls and that the task, the magnitude of the task, and something that they hadn't done for all that time. And of course, they couldn't do it. They had reasons they couldn't do it that you talked about. But now that they're free to do it and they put their hand to the work, they get it done in such a short period of time. Such a great lesson for us.
Yeah, absolutely. The power of focus is amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for your good comments and questions and points. And actually, there's a singing on Wednesday, so remember that. And go ahead and read Nehemiah 9 through 11 for next Sunday. All right, thank you guys.